I'd like to welcome everyone to Exodus Marching to Freedom. We have the pleasure of learning, as we have for the past several weeks and months, with Rabbi David Silber on this ongoing series of Exodus. This class is a careful study of the story of Exodus, including the Paschal sacrifice, crossing the Red Sea, and the beginnings of the desert journey. Thank you all for coming on this lovely Sunday morning or afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. Sources for today's class will be shared on screen from Sefaria, though you are very welcome to follow along in your preferred Tanakh or Chumash. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi David Silber.
Thank you, Caleb. Okay, so we're going to continue. We have this week and next as we march through the book of Exodus. So we're going to begin with chapter 13, the 17th Pasuk, which is actually Parshat B'Shalach. We'll begin our study by Hi B'Shalach Paro Ta'am. V'onacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim ki karovu. Ki amar Elohim pen yinachem ha'am b'rotam milchama v'shavu Mitzrayim. So before I get to what I think is the central question about the verse, just wanted to point out something else. The verse says that when B'Shalach Paro, when Paro sent the people out, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines. I just want to point out, we think back to the actual moment when Israel is told to leave Egypt, which is back in chapter 13. And what's interesting over there is we didn't actually look at it that carefully, but if you look back for a moment at chapter 13, beginning in the 31st Pasuk, this is after the plague of this killing of the firstborn. So the Torah says in verse 31 of chapter 13, Vayikra Moshe u'Aaron Laila, Vayomer kumu tzu mitoch ami gam atem gam bnei Yisrael u'lechu ivdu et Hashem k'daberchem. Paro calls Moshe and Aaron. Remember, Moshe had said to Paro said, don't come to see me anymore. And Moshe had said, I'm not going to come to see you anymore. And the commentaries point out, I'm not going to come to see you anymore, but you may come to see me. And that's what happens in verse number 31, that Paro summons Moshe and Aaron. So anyway, Paro calls Moshe and Aaron. He says, arise, leave from amidst my people, and serve God as you spoke. Not only that, you can take the cattle as well. Gam tzonechem, gam bekarchem kuchu, kashet dibartem volechu, uveirachtem gam oti. So what Paro says to them essentially is Moshe had been negotiating with Paro all along, as we have studied. And the end of it, Paro said, listen, whom do you want to take with you? And Moshe had said at the end, all the people and also the animals, because we have to sacrifice to God. And also, Paro, if you would kindly give us some animals yourself, that'll be very nice. And Paro says, forget about it, of course. But over here, what Paro was saying to Moshe is, all those requests you made in the past about the men, the women, the children, the cattle, and you even asked me to send you some animals as well. It's all good. Take everybody, and not only that, when you bring your sacrifices, give me a blessing too. That's what Paro says. That's in verses 31 and 32. But the next verse, Vatechazak Mitzrayim Alaam Lemaher L'Shalcham Min Haaretz Ki Amru Kulan Meitim. Suddenly the Torah turns its attention to Mitzrayim, to the people of Egypt. And they're rushing to get them out of the land. They're saying, listen, we're all going to die. They see people dying right and left. They don't want to die. So they in a sense, Vatechazak, here they translate to urge. It's even more than urging. They sort of force them out. And the Torah continues with that theme of being forced out of Egypt. The Torah says, they took their dough before it could leaven. They're carrying the kneading bowls on their shoulders. And then they borrow or they ask the Egyptians to give them gifts. By Yeshalumi Mitzrayim, play Kesef, play Zahav. The people are favored by the Egyptian people, and they despoil Egypt. And the point is, in the continuation of those verses, it describes the 600,000 that leave, the men, the Erev Rav that goes with them. And in verse number 39, Vayofuta botzek asher otziu mi Mitzrayim ugod matzot kilo chametz ki garshu mi Mitzrayim ulo yochlu hitzmameya v'gam sedar lo asu lahem. They baked the unleavened bread. They had no time to bake bread because they had to rush out of Egypt. For they were garshu mi Mitzrayim. They were sent out of Egypt, driven out of Egypt, and they had no ability to tarry. Lo yochlu hitzmameya. And they had prepared, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now, the point is, if you read these verses together, what it appears to say is this, that Paro and the people are saying two very different things. The people are saying, get out, leave, goodbye. Here, we'll give you gifts as well. Remember that the giving of gifts later in the book of Devarim is something you give the slave when you free the slave. When you free your slaves, do not send them away empty-handed. Hanek tanikro. The term the Torah uses is garshu mi Mitzrayim, gerushin, divorce, being sent away ostensibly permanently from their perspective. They rushed them out. When you see what Paro said, though, if you look carefully at what Paro said, Paro never actually says that. Paro never actually says in chapter 12, goodbye, don't come back. He doesn't say that. He says something very different. He says, all those requests you made about going out to the desert to bring sacrifices to your God, you can do all that. Now, he suspected that they intended to run away. But we recall in our study of the negotiation that at one point he had said to Moshe, don't go too far. You can bring in sacrifices, don't go too far. The point being, don't go so far that you can't, that you don't go so far in order that you will not be able to run away. So at the end of the day, what Paro actually says in chapter 12, he never actually says, goodbye, you're free. The Egyptian people say, goodbye, you're free, for their own reasons, they're afraid. But in retrospect, when you think about these verses, Paro himself never actually said that. All he said was, the request you have made earlier about sacrificing in the desert with the animals, with all the people, you can do that. And give me a bracha too. But that alone would not suggest that they're not going to return, because earlier Paro made it clear, I will do this on the condition that you will return. And the assumption is that they're going to return. So that's actually a very important point. I want to point that out. But now in chapter 13, verse 17 in Paschal, now we go up when Paro sent the people out, and the Torah makes this point now that God took them on a strange path. We'll come to that. But my point is that Paro is going to change his mind later on when he thinks that Israel was lost in the desert. But if we think about it, in a certain sense, he's not fully changing his mind. No, he probably understands the Egyptian people have sent them away. But Paro personally never actually sends them away. Just parenthetically, by the way, since I mentioned the verse that says that when Israel left Egypt, they had not baked any bread, any leavened dough, because they could not tarry. They had no time to bake the bread, and they had prepared no other provision. So they ate matzah on the way out. And the question that the commentaries raise is that the reason that they ate matzah? Didn't the Torah say earlier in chapter 12, pretty clearly, that on the night you are to bring the Paschal sacrifice in the day of the 14th, eat it at night, and then the Torah continued at some length, saying, and for the next 7 days we have a holiday called Chag HaMatzot, the festival of matzah. And the Torah says, furthermore, not only do you eat matzah for 7 days, you can't even have chametz in your possession. Lo yera'eh lecha chametz and lo yimatzeh lecha, bal yera'eh and bal yimatzeh. So what does it mean to say they baked matzah? Because they had no time to tarry. Lo yochlu hitzmameya. Aren't they eating matzah because they're celebrating the holiday of Pesach for 7 days? What we call Pesach, Chag HaMatzot for 7 days. What is the Torah talking about? This is the question that the commentaries discuss. I didn't want to mention just one possible answer. The Ramban is a different answer, but one simple answer is, as some commentaries say, and I think personally think it's the best answer I've seen, which is that when the Torah speaks about the celebration of Chag HaMatzot, it's not talking about in Egypt. The Torah is saying something else, which is a question when you read the whole chapter 12. That right now we have the observance of the Paschal sacrifice in Egypt. Later on, perhaps when you come into the land, some point later, there will also be a festival called Chag HaMatzot. But the first Pesach, there was no Chag HaMatzot. The first Pesach, there's Chag HaPesach. But Chag HaMatzot comes later on. That would explain the verse. Nonetheless, they did eat only matzah. Not because they're observing Chag HaMatzot, but because they had no time to make bread. Because we were thrown out of Egypt by the Egyptian people, and we could not tarry. We discussed that in the past. Torah seems to be suggesting if we could have been mit mameya, we would have been mit mameya. Mit mameya means not just to tarry, it means to tarry, it means to delay something you should be doing, but do not do. That's a whole separate question. In any event, let's get back to our verse, which begins at the time that Paro sent the people out. And here the Torah says, God did not take them by the way of the path of the Philistines. Ki karovhu. Let's see. The question here is a simple one. What does the word ki mean? Ki karovhu. So the translation that I'm seeing, which I think is the JPS translation, they say, although it was nearer. Sometimes the word ki can have different meanings in the Bible. Sometimes it means despite the fact. It usually means because. Rashi says in one place, ki has 4 different meanings. The translator here that we have in front of us, at least the JPS, says ki means despite the fact. God did not lead them by the land of the Philistines, right up the Mediterranean coast. There's an old road, and the historians talk about this, passes what we call Azov today, these various cities, which apparently the Egyptians in those times had fortified. So that's the shortest path to get to Israel. But God did not take them by the land of the Philistines, even that's the natural way to go. That's the shortest route. But even though it was close, Kikarov means even though it was near, because God said, listen, if they see war, they may turn back. That's one possible reading of the verse. That's the translation that we have in front of us, the JPS. However, the word ki actually usually doesn't mean that. The word ki usually means because. So if we read it this way, it reads that when Paro sent Israel out of Egypt, God did not take them by the way of the Philistines because it was close. Because it was close. For God said, lest people regret when they see war and return. And it strikes me there's a big difference between the translation of although it was close and the translation because it was close. Because the translation, although it was close, there the focus is it's the closest way to go, but there are a lot of tough people there, and there's going to be perhaps very hard battles, difficult battles, and when they see war, they're going to turn back. That's clearly what it says. But if we read the other way, in which the word ki means what it usually means, because it was close, not despite, but because it was close, then it's a different focus. That what the Torah seems to be saying is, God did not take them by the shortest way because it was close. That is to say, it was too soon. Because God understands the people aren't actually ready to enter the land. There the focus is on the people's unreadiness to leave. These are a bunch of slaves. Okay, there's a process of becoming a people. There's the Korban Pesach. There's all of that. But at the end of the day, right at the very beginning, the Torah is making a very important statement. These are people that are not yet ready to set up their own society. In a way, it sort of prefigures what the story of the Torah will be, namely the wandering in the desert. And in point of fact, that's exactly where they head. They head to the desert. They're going to head to the desert, going to walk through the desert, which is traveling sort of south, instead of just traveling up the coast, which would be the normal way to go. And here the focus, and this is actually, I think, a very, very important point, that the Torah is already suggesting that this people is not yet ready to fulfill the promise that was given of creating your own society, a different kind of society, etc. They're not ready yet, and therefore God is delaying the entry into the land until they possibly could become ready. So the two readings of the key over here, two very different readings of key, is a different focus to each one. But the simple reading of key, because it's close, we can't have them come right away, because if they came right away, it would not succeed. And yes, there'll be a war, but that's not the focus. The focus is because it's close. Because it's close, whatever happens, they're going to turn back. And in point of fact, if we think ahead in what the story of the Torah is, that's exactly what actually does happen. That's the story of the spies. That's the story of the Meraglim. They see a difficult war ahead of them, and what do they say? Nitna rosh v'noshuva Mitzrayim. Let's go back to Egypt. So the concern the Torah has over here about lest they see war and turn back is a very real one, which is realized later on in the Torah, in the book of Bamidbar. Okay, so let's get back to our verse. I'll read a little more, and then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. Torah says that Lo Nacham Elohim, Nacham is to guide, the Hanchot is to guide them. God did not guide them by the way of the land of the Philistines, Kikarovu, because God said, Pen yinachem ha'am, lest the people regret, Biratam milchama v'shavu Mitzrayim, lest they regret. So Nacham, a certain way, Pen yinachem. Let's take one more verse over here, and then I'll stop and take any questions, comments, etc. Vayisov Elohim et ha'am derech hamidbar Yamsuf. V'chamushim aru v'nei Yisrael ve'eretz Mitzrayim. I want to turn our attention to the word Vayasev. Vayasev means from the word saviv, to go around. Here they translate, God led the people round about in a circuitous route. Right? The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Where they're going misaviv, they're going round about. Vayasev, God is causing Israel to go round about. And by the way of the desert, by Yamsuf, Israel went up from Egypt, Chamushim. I'll get to the word Chamushim in a minute. But I didn't want to make a point about Vayasev Elohim et ha'am derech hamidbar Yamsuf, of God. Vayasev, God is causing us to go in a roundabout way. And the question is, what do we make of this idea of Vayasev? So I've actually talked about this and actually written about this elsewhere. My book on the Megillah, I have in that book I discuss, among other things, the role of God in the Megillah. God is not mentioned in the Megillah at all. But I did suggest a way to read the Megillah in which God is very central to the book. I'm not going to get into all the details of that. I think it's a very interesting interpretation. But the claim I make is one way to read the Megillah. There's several different ways to read it. But one way to read the Megillah is that actually God's intention in the Megillah is to fight God's war. God has a war, and we'll get to this a couple of chapters later, against Amalek. Amalek in the Bible is God's enemy. And that actually, in the Megillah, it's a war against Amalek. Haman is the Agagite, he's the Amalekite. His army is in a sense an Amalekite army. And one way to read the Megillah is that God is in fact waging a war against Amalek, but God is using God's proxies. That God's proxies, perhaps unbeknownst to themselves, but God is using God's proxies to fight against Amalek. That's the claim I make in the book, and I think it's quite an interesting claim. I'm not going to get into the Megillah and what I see in the Megillah to support such a claim. But my point is that one way in thinking about that, what's interesting is that one way to read this verse, Vayasev Elohim et ha'am, derech hamidbar Yam Suf, that God causes Israel to go in a roundabout way. And by the way, it's not just in a roundabout way, because the path that God takes Israel, and we'll get to this in a few moments, but the path that God takes Israel positions us, when we get to chapter 14, right in front of the sea. So in front of us is the sea, and behind us is the Egyptian army, and there's no place to go. And how did we end up in that situation? How did we end up in a place where there's absolutely no place to go? Where in front of us is the sea, death, and behind us is the Egyptian army, death. How did we ever end up in that terrible situation? What happened? Was it human error? Was it navigational mistake? No. Torah says how. Vayasev Elohim et ha'am derech hamidbar Yam Suf. That God actually is placing us there. It's rather remarkable. God is placing us there, a kind of bait, so that the Egyptian army will proceed, trying to annihilate us, and there will be the opportunity for God then to bring us to safety, to cross the sea, at the same time to drown the Egyptian army. So the word Vayasev then is a very, very interesting word, and it suggests a certain kind of reading in which we are, one might say, even pawns, or we're part of God's larger plan. Because God has said consistently, God has been very consistent about this, that one of the purposes of the Exodus was to demonstrate to the world, including to Egypt, if not even primarily to Egypt, the fact that God exists in the land, that God is all powerful, that God is more powerful than the Egyptian gods. In order to do this, the kavda b'faro, that word kavod that appears throughout the story, God is going to use Israel, use us as bait to encourage Paro to attack and then destroy Paro. So this word Vayasev then is quite an interesting word. There's more to say about Vayasev, maybe at a future date. Now, let me stop here for a moment and take any comments or questions. So I've made 4 points so far. If anybody has comments or questions about this, let's speak up, please.
Nothing in chat, but I see, Susan, you have a hand up.
I just want to comment that Rabbi Menachem Leibtag always said that when the Torah uses the word Pesach, it's never talking about the holiday, it's always talking about the Korban Pesach, and that Hashem only refers to the holiday as Chag HaMatzot, and I think that fits in with exactly what you were saying.
That's certainly true. Yes, that is definitely true. There's one place actually where it's not clear, and actually, it talks about this. The Balei HaTosfot, actually, of all people, talk about this. But generally speaking, that is correct. That in Torah, Chag HaMatzot is not Pesach. Pesach's the 14th. Torah says on the 14th day, Pesach Lashem. On the 15th is Chag HaMatzot. The Torah is explicit about that, and that's certainly the case. Yeah. Does anybody else have any comments or questions or whatever?
Nothing in chat right now.
Nothing else. Okay. I made several points. No one. Okay, fine. Let us continue. Fine. Now I want to raise a different question, and I'd like to hear what you think. And that is the word "V'chamushim oru v'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim." What does it mean that Israel went up out of Egypt chamushim? I've always wondered about this myself. So, what the translation we have in front of us, and it's the one that I grew up with, that chamush, in modern Hebrew, it's that way, it means to be armed, right? It means to be armed, have ammunition, to be armed. That Israel went out of Egypt, chamushim, armed. I find that a very odd statement for 2 reasons. First of all, where would they get these arms? How could they have arms? I mean, were some of the gifts they got, rifles or swords? I mean, what armed with what? Knives? What? And second of all, what would be the point of saying that? Isn't the point of the story later on that they don't have the arms, or if they have arms, they don't have the chariots and the horsemen? Isn't the point of the story later on that when they see the Egyptian army with their chariots and horsemen and all that, that they recognize that it's pretty hopeless? They don't anticipate a fight. How can they fight them? They have nothing to fight with. Therefore, I think the word chamushim as armed it's very strange. Like, it's hard to believe that chamushim means armed. If it doesn't mean armed, what does it mean actually? So if we may recall in our study of Sefer Bereshit, and we remarked upon this, didn't say much about it, that for whatever reason, the word chamesh, which means 5, appears over and over again in the story when the Torah tells the story of Joseph in Egypt. In fact, Joseph sends 5 brothers. Joseph says to speak to Pharaoh later. Joseph says that 5 more years of famine. The Egyptian priests give 1/5 of to Pharaoh. He gets a chomesh. But the word chomesh, or chamesh, appears in a context which may be related to this. It's when Joseph was summoned before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. And Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. There'll be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And then Joseph gives his advice to Pharaoh about how to sustain the country. His point is that that during the 7 years, Pharaoh should take control of the food, put it in storage places, under his control, under his watch, take it, and that food, and then that during the years of famine, the land of Egypt will be sustained from the food that Pharaoh has taken during the years of plenty. I'm trying to find the verse over here, but I know the verse, I'm just trying to find the source. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, let's see if I can find this verse.
In the meantime,
41.
Chapter 41, verse number 34. It was Joseph's advice to Pharaoh about how to deal with the years of plenty that are beginning right now. That was his point to Pharaoh. The dream that you had twice is one dream, but God is trying to get an urgent message through to you. It's starting now. It's not going to happen later on. The years of plenty start today. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of terrible famine. And therefore, he says, Pharaoh has to appoint somebody and appoint overseers over the land. Yaseh Pharaoh v'yafkei p'kidim al haaretz, appoint officers over the land. V'chimeish et eretz Mitzrayim, v'sheva shnei hasava. And Pharaoh should v'chimeish, right? Now, what does v'chimeish mean over there? So I see the JPS says, he says, organize. On the
Rabbi
bottom,
Silber,
yes.
can you share the pasuk so I can pull this up on screen?
Yes.
I didn't catch it.
Chapter 41, verse 34. Chapter 41 of chapter 41 of Bereshit. Chapter 41 of Bereshit, verse 34. So when Joseph is interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, and then Joseph actually gives his advice to Pharaoh. Apparently, Joseph, the advice he gives to Pharaoh, he justifies it, I believe, by saying this is part of the dream. Because God is saying to you, act now. I didn't know how to act now. You have to devise a plan immediately. So let me help you with that. You collect all the food during the years of plenty. And you appoint pikidim, officers, to guard, to watch, to guard the food. You're going to keep it. It's under your control. You're going to control the food. And then, v'chimeish et eretz Mitzrayim v'sheva shnei hasava. You should be v'chimeish et eretz Mitzrayim. So the JPS has 2 different possible translations. V'chimeish, take a 5th part. I doubt that it means that. V'chimeish, they have organized. I have no idea how they got to that. Then they have a 3rd possibility. Meaning of Hebrew uncertain, which is what the JPS often has. But what it does sound like, the chimesh, is somehow to strengthen the nation, because they will have food. They'll have that which can sustain them. And I suspect that the chamushim oru v'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim does not mean that they went out armed. I can't fathom how they would even have arms. But it probably means something else. They went out, they had enough to sustain them. Going out to a desert. The point is, the first half of the verse says they're going out to the desert. unless you ask the question, how can you go to a desert? Within one day, they'll all die of hunger. No. They left chamushim. They did take supplies with them. Didn't have time to bake bread, but they went out chamushim. They're not being sent out to the desert with nothing. It reminds me of the story of Hagar and Yishmael that Avram sent away. And he gives them a chemat mayim and he gives them lechem. In other words, they have enough to live in the desert to get to their destination, but Hagar gets lost and they run out of water. But it's not that Abraham sent them with nothing. You don't send people to a desert with without food and water. They have enough. In other words, the Torah is explaining when he got them to the desert. They should go Eretz Plishtim. No, Derech HaMidbar. But don't worry about it. They Chamushim Oru B'nei Yisrael Me'eretz Mitzrayim. And I mentioned this here for two reasons. I'll come to it in a moment. But just let's keep in mind the word Chamushim, which is a very strange word. But again, I wanted to emphasize it's a word, the word Chamesh, the Chimesh, Chamesh, etc., is a word that we find specifically in that number 5 appears several times in the Joseph story in connection with Egypt. I mentioned 4 or 5 different situations.
Rabbi Silber,
yes.
Just to bring up a comment that came up in chat.
Yes.
From Niva saying maybe quote fortified encompasses the quote armed meaning as well.
Could be. I mean, my point is that fortified, I think, is a good translation. Actually, I'm just saying I don't think it means. The point of the Torah is not they actually are armed. I don't think that's the point, because in the story it's clear that that can't be a battle. That Israel, left to their own devices, don't have the wherewithal to fight against the Egyptian army.
Nowadays,
their army with,
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, nowadays we use the word fortified, like vitamins fortify you, like
right,
not,
exactly. Right.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Fortified is a very good translation. I'm going to come back to Chamushim in a minute. I'll get back to that. There's a reason I spent time on this word. It's not just about the word, but let's read a little more. Okay. Now the next verse is very striking. Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo. Ki hashbeah hishbiah et bnei Yisrael lemor. Hakod yifkod Elohim etchem, v'avitem et atzmotai mizeh itchem. The Torah says subtly that Moshe took the bones of Joseph with him. For Joseph had imposed an oath upon his brothers, Bnei Yisrael, which means in the context, the sons of Jacob, right? The very last verses of the book of Breshit, we all remember it. Joseph said to the brothers, Vayashba Yosef, he imposes upon them an oath, after I die, someday God will bring you back to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Take my bones with you. And here the Torah tells us that, in fact, Israel does take Atzmot Yosef with them, recalls the oath. But very interestingly, the verse does not say, Vayikach b'nei Yisrael et Atzmot Yosef. That's what you would expect it to say. But rather, Vayikach Moshe et Atzmot Yosef imo. For some reason, the Torah specifically talks about Moshe, and Moshe taking the bones of Joseph. There are many midrashim about this. There's a lot of drashot about why Dafka Moshe. But let's just note that it's Moshe that takes the Atzmot Yosef imo. And the Torah here recalls the oath, almost word for word, the oath that Joseph imposed upon his brothers at the very end of Sefer Breshit. And the question is, when you read such a verse, there are really 2 questions. Why does the Torah mention it at all, actually? And why does it mention it over here? And why does it connect it specifically with Moshe? Vayikach Moshe et Atzmot Yosef imo. And it strikes me that actually the Torah is recalling the story of Joseph over here, and the very last thing that Joseph says. This is the conclusion of Sefer Breshit, and the Torah wants us to consider the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph is the story of really the first slave. He's the first slave in Egypt, the first Jewish slave in Egypt in the biblical narrative, and he goes through a whole change in terms of who is Joseph, because certainly when he first comes to Egypt, he is, at least the way he appears, He's an Egyptian in every way. He dresses like an Egyptian. Pharaoh gives him the coat of the Egyptian. He's married to an Egyptian woman, the daughter of an Egyptian priest. He named his first son Forgetfulness. He works for the Pharaoh. He works in the court, etc. He drives a chariot, which is the symbol of Egypt. In every which way, looking at him, and he basically says, "I want to forget my past." But then, the story of Joseph is how, in fact, he reconnects to his past. One reason is that on a moral plane, he never can fully adopt the way of Egypt. That's the story of Mrs. Potiphar. But then what happens is he meets his brothers, and then he meets his father. And meeting his brothers first and his father afterwards, and especially his father, who basically teaches Joseph, in those 17 years, teaches Joseph what it means to be part of the Jewish people. And at the end of the book of Breshit, remarkably, Joseph lectures the brothers about the land of Israel. Listen, someday God's going to redeem us. You guys swear to bring us back to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the one who has incorporated Jacob's teachings more than any other brother. And that's the message in the last word in the book of Breshit. And in thinking about this, perhaps what the Torah is saying over here, that the Jewish people are leaving Egypt. And I think what's being highlighted over here, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, Kikarovu, that it's going to be a process of becoming a Jewish people. Because in the land of Egypt, in which we were in for many, many years, we were part of Egypt, and we still want to go back to Egypt. And throughout the story of the desert, it's always talk about returning to Mitzrayim. The person who has no interest in returning to Mitzrayim is, of course, Moshe. And here the Torah links up Moshe with Joseph, with the Joseph that appeared in the very last verses of the book of Breshit. And what the Torah seems to be underscoring here, and I think it's a deep truth, is that Moshe is basically just continuing the path of Joseph. Moshe is essentially what Joseph would have become. And Joseph lived longer. He dies at 110. Had he lived longer, he might have been morphed into Moses. So when Moshe picks up where Joseph leaves off, and we'll see this later on in Sefer Shemot as well. By the same token, one has to wonder, what about the people? Are Moshe and the people in the same place? And here I think the Torah is saying, or hinting at, not so, that actually Moshe's thinking one thing. Moshe's on the way to the land. That's what Joseph had said. When God will take you out, bring you to the land, take me with you, I want to be with you in the land. And from Moshe's perspective, that is the mission. We're going to the land. But the people are in a very different place. They may well not be ready to enter the land. And the Torah wants us to consider that from the very beginning. And we'll see this again. There's another hint of this right in this very story as well. But let me read a few more verses, then again I'll stop and take comments or questions. Vayisumi Sukkot. So the people are now traveling from a place called Sukkot. Vayachanu b'Etam b'Kseim Bar. They dwell in Etam by the edge of the desert. Vashem olech lifnehem yomam b'Amud Anan an Chotam Aderech v'Layla b'Amud Eish Lo'ir Lahem olechet yomam v'Layla Lo Yamish Amud Anan yomam b'Amud Eish Layla lifneham. So the Torah now tells us, how is God guiding us through the desert? The Torah said in the first verse we started with today, Lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim. God did not guide them by the way of the Philistines. Now the Torah says, how is God guiding us through the desert? And the answer is, God is guiding us. God's presence is represented by the Anan that leads us in the daytime, and the Eish, Amud Eish, which lights up the night, to walk day and night. Apparently, they're not just walking in the day and sleeping at night. Apparently, Israel is walking in the day and also walking at night. Yomam v'layla. And the Torah says that this pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire by night does not depart from the people. Lo yamish, amud ha'anan yomam, v'amuda eish layla. So here there's a play again on lo yamish, and the fact that Vayikach Moshe, that's what you'll say, Pimo, the thing underscores the point I'm trying to make. Namely, Moshe is totally in sync with God. Moshe understands the goal, and he's headed towards that goal. And Joseph said that when you go to the land, take me with you. Let's go into the land. Where are the people in all this? That we'll see. But Moshe is clearly on a path here. Let me just stop here for a moment, then comments and questions, then we'll continue with our story.
I'd like to highlight a few questions that came in from
Yes.
chat. First, from Ruth Shane, she points out that verse 18 hints at Yosef plus as Yud Vav Samech Pei is Yam Suf Chamishim Chamesh. Ruth, can you clarify on that a bit?
Sure. Like you look at the word Yamsuf, and that's Yosef. It's a hint. So there's Yosef and Chamushim. Those two words are together. Like you were saying, the story of Yosef is replete with Chamesh. And there's a hint in verse 18 that we are talking about Yosef. When you look at Yamsuf together, the Yamsuf Chamushim. So you throw out the mem, and that's Yosef.
Okay, that's certainly possible. There's actually even a better hint we'll get to in a minute. I think you don't need that many hints because the Torah actually mentions Joseph explicitly over here in that last speech that he gave. But what you're saying may well be true because often when you find a connection, you find many other literary, I call them literary effects. You wouldn't build a case on it. Case is built on something else, but these sort of add in, they're sort of fuel to the fire. They strengthen the case. Let's put it that way. Yes, thank you for that.
Richard, I see you have a hand up.
Yes, so maybe it's worth mentioning in your connections between Moshe and Yosef in this point here is that it was Yosef who was at the other end, Yaakov Ishbia at Yosef, to take his body back to the land. And because Yosef was the one who could do it, and as you said, Yosef was the one, as we saw later, is the one who had the connection to the land more than the brothers.
Yes.
And so it's appropriate that Moshe should fulfill Yosef's injunction as it was that Yosef should fulfill Yaakov's.
Right, and that's certainly true. And actually, it even underscores another point that's not for us now, but the fact that Moshe himself is not buried in the land, which is very striking. Here's someone who was working so hard to make sure that Joseph can be buried in the land, and also working hard to make sure that Israel will possess the land, and he himself does not possess the land. He's buried outside the land, which is really stunning in a way. Yeah, okay, that's true. Certainly true. It's certainly true that Yosef is simply, as I said before, he's Jacob's primary pupil. Everything Jacob is teaching about the land, Joseph puts into practice. Is there any other comment?
Earlier, when when Joseph is talking to Pharaoh about the appointment, the phrase I don't have it in front of me, and I don't recall it exactly, but the Pokai Difkai phrase appears there just as it appears here. So there's another
very good
reminder.
point. That Laszlo's a very good point. There's a lot to say about it. I mean, let me just respond to you. It's an excellent point. I think that one of the themes, I think that one of the Joseph themes is what I said before. It's Joseph's transformation within the land of Egypt, which I said there were three things. First of all, on some moral plane, he just can't be Egyptian. That's the Mrs. Potiphar story, because the Egyptians take what they see. Joseph can't do that. But then, of course, we have the influence of the brothers and the influence of his father. And what's interesting is that one of the ways that the Chumash emphasizes the transformation is by initially using some language that we think of in terms of covenantal language. But it used it for Joseph in the context of Mitzrayim. For example, it says that Joseph gathered all the food of Egypt during those 7 years of plenty. It says Kechol Hayam, right? That he was the marbe, the food. Now when you read Kechol Hayam, When you read the book of Breshit, Kachol Hayam, that's God's blessing to the patriarchs, that your descendants will be at the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak. Kafara Aretz, Kachol Hayam, right? But with Joseph, he's gathering the food from Mitzrayim, Kachol Hayam. And the example you give is a very good one, which is, he says to Paro, Yafkeit Pekidim ala Aretz, that Paro should appoint Pekidim, officers or whatever, over the land of Egypt to control, to take the food and to marshal the food and to parcel out the food. But fundamentally, the food all belongs to Pharaoh. And that's what allows Pharaoh to control everything, because the food becomes the mechanism. Since it's a monopoly, he can take all their money, he can take all their cattle, he can take all their land, which is what he does. Joseph makes Pharaoh the owner of the land of Egypt. And that term, Yafkeit Pekidim, but the very end of Breshit, we have the same term again, but Pokod Yifkod Elohim Etchem, which is picked up, by the way, earlier in the book of in Shemot that we saw. So it's another example of how language, which initially is in the context of Joseph the Egyptian, Joseph working in the court of Pharaoh, Joseph strengthening Pharaoh. But by the time you get to the end of Joseph's life, the very end of Sefer Breshit, he's talking in Jacob's voice. Everything Jacob had said, Joseph understands, and it's a wonderful example. It underscores this transformation. That's a very good point. And there probably are other instances as well where the language is initially used. I gave the answer for Kachol Hayam, which is a good example. There are probably others as well. But the larger point is certainly true. Okay, let's take a few more verses over here. Fun.
And people had more, and for the people who had more questions, we'll get to at the next break.
Go ahead.
Okay. Just Susan, I see you have your hand up. Do you still have questions, or?
I'm sorry, that was from before. Sorry, I didn't take it down.
Okay, let's. I'll take another more questions in a minute. I just want to make one other point first. We have chapter 14. Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemor. Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yashuvu v'yachanu l'fnei pi achirot bein Migdol u'bein Hayam l'fnei Baal Tzifon nichacho tachanu al Hayam. So now God says, speak to the children of Israel. They should turn back, right? Turn back, Yashuvu, and encamp before Pi Achirot, between Migdol and the sea. And specifically, L'fnei Baal Tzifon, you shall encamp facing it. And then God continues, V'yomar Paro l'bnei Yisrael nevuchim hein ba'aretz. Paro will say, they're turning back, they're confused, they're nevuchim, they're confused. So Gar Elohim Midbar, the desert is closing on them, the wilderness is closing on them. Again, I will strengthen Pharaoh's heart, he'll chase after you. And I will achieve glory and honor before Pharaoh and all his hosts. That Egypt know that I am the Lord. And so they did. So I just wanted to make one small point over here. The larger point I made before about putting Israel in a place, God is putting us in a place which on the face of it is the most dangerous place to be. There's no way to escape. Death in front, death behind. What's curious is exactly where we are to be positioned. And that is Lifnei Baal Tzifon. Now, what is Baal Tzifon? So Baal Tzifon clearly is some kind of Egyptian god. We know in general that Tzafon, the north, Tzafon, was known in the ancient Near East as a place of the gods. You know that Baal was the term used throughout the Bible for a certain god, maybe a fertility god. And Baal Tzifon is probably some kind of Egyptian god. And Israel is to encamp before Baal Tzifon. And I emphasize this because Baal Tzifon, or a variant of Baal Tzifon, has come up earlier in the Torah. And that is, once again, back to Joseph the Egyptian. When Joseph, I mentioned before, Joseph dresses like an Egyptian, and he has the chariot, and he's married to the daughter of the priest of Egypt, and all of that's true. But on top of all that, there's something else. Vayikra Paro Shem Yosef Sofnat Paneach. That Pharaoh gives Joseph a name, an Egyptian name, not Joseph, Safnat Paneach. Now, exactly what Safnat Paneach is, who knows? It's usually it's interpreted, which I don't think can be the simple shot. The interpreter of dreams, the one who can uncover the meaning of riddles, that which is hidden, Safun is hidden. But the simple meaning of Safnat, whatever Safnat Paneach is, it sounds like an Egyptian name. And frankly, since he marries him to the daughter of the priest of On, Cohen On, it would not be surprising if the name that Joseph is given is actually a name related to one of the many gods of Egypt. I suggest Baal Zephon. And over here, we have Baal Zephon, that the Israel is to encamp in front of Baal Zephon, and given the fact that it's been a focus on Joseph and the promise of Joseph and the bones of Joseph, so it's very striking because Baal Zephon reminds us actually of where Joseph once was. Joseph was once Joseph the Egyptian, and here once again, another reference to Joseph, to encamp in front of Baal Zephon. And perhaps part of it is that God had said earlier explicitly to Moshe, Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shvatim ani Hashem, that I will wreak havoc upon the gods of Egypt. And perhaps over here, what's about to happen, I would say not perhaps, definitely, what's about to happen is the final coup de grace, as it were, of all that's taken place before. The story of the crossing of the sea is to be understood as the final step. You have the plagues, you have the 9 plagues, you have the 10th plague. Then you have the final step over here, which is the crossing of the sea. We read the story of the crossing of the sea of Yam Suf as the final act in God's intervention in Mitzrayim. In fact, I would suggest that Yam Suf, which now people call it now the Red Sea, but it literally means the seed of reeds, Suf of reeds. But again, the unvocalized Bible, unvocalized Hebrew, Samach Vav Pei, can be read not only as Suf, but as Sof. And in fact, the Torah plays upon this because Moshe tells the people who are about to complain, why did you take us out of Egypt? And Moshe says to them, don't worry about it. You've seen the Egyptians today. Lo tosifu lirotam od ad olam. You will never see them again. Lo tosifu lirotam ad olam. God will fight for you and you shall be silent. And once again, we have a play upon the name Yosef, of course. And it's also the end of the story. And the point I want to make is that we should be reading the story over here, crossing the sea, that we'll get to probably next week, as related to the plagues. The Midrashim underscore this, that the story of the crossing of the sea must be read together with the plagues. We recall in the Passover Haggadah, there's a little medrash on the Passover Haggadah that talks about the miracles that took place in Egypt, how many miracles there were, and the Tanaim and the Haggadah all emphasize there were X number of miracles in Egypt, but at the sea, there were so many more miracles. In Egypt, we saw the finger of God, but at the sea, we see the hand of God. So the connection between Yam Suf as the ultimate miracle and the ultimate act of redemption is very much connected to what takes place before. And we know God had said explicitly, Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shvatim ani Hashem. So over here, it once again is the Baal Zephon may be exactly that point. Just one last comment I want to make about Baal Zephon is that Moshe, of course, in the story over here, Moshe is instrumental in bringing Joseph's bones with him, and ultimately Joseph is buried in Shechem. Joseph finds his place. And Moshe does not. Moshe dies in the desert. Says the Torah, we don't know exactly where in the desert he's buried. No one knows. But he doesn't enter into the land. And we know he's buried someplace, speaking of the Torah reading that we just read this past Shabbat. Where is Moshe buried? Mul Beit Pa'ar. Across from Pa'ar. And the story of Pa'ar, of course, Baal Pa'ar, is the story that we read this past Shabbat about the idolatrous worship of Pa'ar by Israel. Baal Pa'ar is the great sin of the second generation, kind of the sequel to the ego. And it's very striking that Moshe is buried Mul Beit Pa'ar, across from Beit Pa'ar. So it's interesting to think about Beit Pa'ar, Mul Beit Pa'ar, and over here it is Nochach, right? Lifnei Baal Tzafon, Nichachot Tachanu Ayam. The difference being that in the case over here, we actually cross over to the other side. In the case of Moshe, he doesn't cross over to the other side, although it is certainly the case that the people never cross over into the land. This generation will not cross over into the land. It will take a full generation to be able to make that jump into the land, to leave Egypt behind them. It takes a full generation. Let me stop here for a moment if any comments or questions, and then we will continue.
From chat, is there a more profound interpretation of Moses bringing back the bones of Joseph?
More profound. So what I said was pretty profound, actually, to tell you the truth. That is to say, to read the Moshe story as a continuation of what Joseph might have been. I think that's actually a very important point, that Moshe picks up where Joseph leaves off. And I'll give you an example of that is rooted in Sefer Shemot. I may have mentioned this earlier when we were studying the very beginning of Sefer Shemot. Joseph has two children. He names his two children. The first one he named Menashe, for he said, God has enabled me to forget my father's house and my suffering. So the name Menashe represents a distancing of Joseph from his family. But the second son, Shem Hashini Kara Ephraim, Ki Ephrani Elohim B'Eretz Ani, son number 2, he called Ephraim, fertility or fruitfulness. God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. The land of his suffering refers to Egypt. So the second son is a recognition, actually, that Egypt is not a good place for us. Egypt is a place of suffering for the Jew. The first child was about distancing from his own family. But the second child already is he's moving in a different direction. Ifrani Elohim B'Eretz Ani. Those are Joseph's two sons. Then Moshe has two sons, which he names. The first he names Gershom. Ger Hayiti B'Eretz Nachriya. Probably referring to Egypt. It says Moshe, I was a ger, I was a foreigner or a stranger in a strange land. In the land of Egypt, it wasn't my place, which is beyond Joseph. What Joseph said it's a place of Anyi. What Moshe is saying is I'm a ger. This is not me. I don't belong there. I recognize, having left Mitzrayim, it was never my place. And then you have the second son of Moshe, mentioned in Parshat Yitro. He named Eliezer. Elohei Avi B'Ezri Vayatzileni Mecherev Paro. The God of my father assisted me and saved me from Pharaoh's sword. And that's exactly the opposite of Menashe. Because Menashe, Joseph had said, Nashani Elohim et Amoli v'et kol beit Avi. It's about forgetting his father's house. And the name Eliezer is all about connecting to the God of his father, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which was the revelation in the sneh. So you can see a clear progression that Moshe is picking up where Joseph might have been there, but Joseph dies at 110, one might say prematurely, because Torah says 120 of the maximum years. Moshe lives to 120. But the point is, when you read the story of Moshe, he's simply picking up where Joseph left off. And that is actually, I think, a very important point. Everybody is limited in this world. And what you try to do is to set something up for the future, where others can pick up where you left off. It doesn't mean they will necessarily agree with what you did. They may not agree at all. But you set people on a certain trajectory. And that's what the book of Exodus is all about. It's about setting Israel on a certain trajectory. And that Moshe succeeds. It takes 2 generations. But he doesn't fail. Moshe's not a failure. Moshe is a great success. Of course, you have to understand where people are. You can't take the Egyptian slaves and bring them into the land. It's not going to happen because they're not capable of that kind of a transformation in 1 generation. So therefore, what the Torah is concerned about is moving things forward. and creating situations where other people can pick up where you have left off. Maybe they do better, they do differently, but they move in a certain trajectory. I think that's pretty profound, I must say. I think that's actually not only profound, I think it's very central to the book, to the Torah in general, and to the tradition in general. Now, there's a lot more to say about Joseph's bones, etc., and there are many midrashim about it. And if you want to see more different understandings of Atzmot Yosef, in the world of Chassidut, there's a big focus on Joseph's bones. But I focused on Joseph's own personal transformation, which is how I read the book of Breshit. If you want to read Joseph differently, Yosef HaTzadik, he never deviated, which I think is far from the pshat. You have a different take on Joseph. But I see Joseph as one who is basically an Egyptian. I mean, it's never black and white, because as I said, from a moral standpoint, he never is fully an Egyptian. But, in many other ways, he is the Egyptian, and somehow he's able to change himself, to transform himself with the help of seeing his brothers, and especially with the help of his father, his great teacher, Yaakov. So therefore, I think that's another important point. And then by contrast, in sync with Moshe, yes. In sync with God, yes. In sync with the people, not so much, as we'll see. That's my suggestion. But of course, there may be many other, maybe better suggestions. But I'm not familiar with them. I've read many different things about Joseph, but the place to look will be in the Hasidic teachings. There they have many different drushes. They often stretch what I call the pshat. Sometimes they're reminds of sort of modern midrash. They don't necessarily, reflect the best pshat. But again, someone said David Foreman has written about this. Well, David Foreman's a good man. Maybe he says some good things. I'm not familiar with it. I know that the place I would look for drushos would be in the teachers of the coming out of the Hasidic world. Okay, we still have some more time. Let me just take a few more minutes on this. Okay, fine. Now, Vayigad L'melech Mitzrayim ki varacham. So the king of Egypt hears the people have run away. He knows they've run away. But ki varacham, two things. First of all, remember that he never gave permission for them to leave. He gave permission to serve their God as they had requested. But he knows probably they're not going to return. However, he said run away means without a clear plan. Here they're running from something, but they seem to be lost. Where are they going? Pharaoh and his avodim, Pharaoh and his court, not all Egyptian people necessarily, but Pharaoh and his servants. What did we do? Why did we allow them to leave? So he orders his chariot. He takes with him Sheish Meot Rechav Bachur, V'chol Rechav Mitzrayim, V'shalishim al Kulo. He took 600 chariots, chosen chariots, the chariots of Egypt, V'shalishim al Kulo, and officers in all of them. Here, by the way, I think we have an interesting play in the Torah between the word Shalishim, which clearly means the people in charge of the riders of the chariots, the soldiers who ride the chariots. Those are Shalishim. A Shalish is an officer. And we had the word earlier, Chamushim. The people go up Chamushim. Fortified is a good translation, but not armed. But Pharaoh doesn't only have fortifications, he has Shalishim. He has weapons, he has an army. And I would add one detail over here, which is not for us to look at now, but an interesting detail, the contrast between those that ride on the horses, the horse and chariot being the symbol of Egypt, but those riding on the horses and those walking by foot. Israel is walking out of Egypt, not riding out of Egypt. They're walking out of Egypt. And this contrast between those on chariots and those on foot, it plays out in a different biblical text, which is based on the story of the Exodus. And that's the story of Deborah in the book of Shoftim, in the war against Sisera. Sisera has the iron chariots, and Barak has foot soldiers. He has infantry, but he doesn't have the chariots. Maybe when we see further in the story, we'll pick up this theme. In any event, again, we saw this earlier. The Torah speaks of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, Does that mean that Pharaoh is forced to do it by God? Does it mean that somehow Pharaoh makes his own decisions, but it's all at the very same time it's part of God's plan? The reading that I prefer. It doesn't mean that people don't make decisions. The Bible in general, the Torah specifically, is about God's plan. But the Torah never suggests that people don't have free will to make decisions. As it says in Pirkei Avot, Hakol Tzafui v'Hareshut Nituna. All is foreseen, but free will is given. And if you ask the question, as the medievals did, isn't that a contradiction? Because if God knows what's going to happen, what choice do we have? And my answer is that's a very good question. And the medievals wrestle with it, and the philosophers wrestle with it. But here's what I would say. That's how the Torah works. Exactly what it says. The Torah never presumes that people are not responsible for what they do. And the Torah never presumes that God doesn't have a plan. God has a plan. 400 years in Egypt. Geirut, Avdut, and Enut. How did we end in Egypt? Well, Joseph and the brothers. Now there's a person who sends Joseph to his brothers, this mysterious man, God's agent. The Torah never wants to suggest that people aren't responsible for what they do. So we have to always work with these two ideas simultaneously, even though they contradict. One is that God has a plan, and the other is that people have free will. And over here, that's Vayechazak Hashem Elei Paro Melech Mitzrayim. I know it's a conceptual contradiction. That is how the Torah seems to work. It's part of God's plan, but Pharaoh is held responsible. Uvenei Yisrael Yotzim Biyad Ramah, but Israel was leaving Biyad Ramah with an outstretched hand. That is to say, here they translate defiantly. I would say perhaps it means openly. A raised up hand. We are marching out of Egypt to freedom. Bnei Yisrael marching to freedom. On the other hand, the Egyptians are going to try to stop us, and they have the weapons to do so. Vayidefu Mitzrayim achareihem, vayasigu otam chonim al hayam, chosus lechev paro parashav v'chelo al pi achirot lifnei Baal Tzafon. So here we have, once again, the Torah is emphasizing this, that the great confrontation is going to take place before Baal Tzafon. It's an Egyptian god, and this is where the confrontation will take place. Now, I think we'll have to, let me just make one other point over here before we stop, which is this. In the ensuing story, Pharaoh was coming. Let's take one more verse. Paro Vikri. Paro was coming. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael et eineihem, v'nei Mitzrayim nosei achreihem. Vayiru ma'od. Vayitzaku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem. Vayamu el Moshe. Amibli ein kfarim b'Mitzrayim u'kachton lubu b'midbar. Mazot asita lanu. U'yotzah miMitzrayim. Hagol zeh hadavar shedibar elechem Mitzrayim lebar. Chadam imenu v'navdot Mitzrayim. Ki tov lanu avodah Mitzrayim mimutenu b'midbar. So here we come to an interesting question. The Torah says that Israel was very frightened in the 10th verse, and they cried out to God, Vayitzaku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem. But in verse 11, they're not talking to God, they're talking to Moshe, and they have a complaint. Why did you take us out? Aren't there enough graves in Egypt? Take us to a desert? We'd rather die in Egypt, right? Better to die in Egypt than die in the desert. It's better to work, to be slaves in Egypt, than to die in the desert. Right? And what's interesting is, how do we reconcile these two statements? Because in verse number 10, they're crying out to God. Crying out to God sounds like it's some kind of a prayer, right? That's what it sounds like. But in verse 11 and verse 12, they're saying something very different. Why do you take us out here? Why did you take us out to the desert to bury us in the desert? And we told you this before. We'll see. We'll discuss next week. Where did they say this? We told you this in Egypt. Leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. We never wanted to leave in the first place. But one question is, how do you reconcile that statement? How do you reconcile verses 11 and 12 with verse number 10? So actually, the Ramban talks about that. Rashi discusses it, and the Midrashim talk about it. So we'll have to pay some attention to that. And then we will come to the actual crossing of the sea. What precedes the crossing of the sea, the actual crossing of the sea, I don't think we're going to get to the Song of the Sea, because next week is the last in this series. But when we start, whenever that is, next, and the next time we start, we will begin with Shirat Hayam, which is, have to spend a fair amount of time on that. But that's the plan, to look at, first of all, what happens before we cross, and then the actual description of the crossing of the sea, which is quite striking. And perhaps we'll get to what I mentioned earlier, the parallel story in the book of Shoftim, the story of Devorah, which is parallel to the story of crossing the sea. I think we'll stop at this point then. But if anybody has one last comment or question, I'll take that.
Just to highlight something that came through in chat earlier in the class. Thank you, Shoshana Schamberg, for recommending a book by Rabbi David Foreman called The Exodus You Almost Passed Over. Quote, a whole book on Joseph and Paro and Jacob as two fathers and Joseph's relationships. Thank you for the recommendation.
Thank you for that.
Rabbi Silber?
Yes.
Would you like to comment now or next time on the both of them are asking the same question? Mazot asinu, says the Paro, and then Mazot asita lanu. People say to Moshe.
Now, which is the first verse?
Mazot asinu. That's what the Paro says. That no, his officers, his officer says to Paro, "God, what have we done? We let them go, you know."
Right.
And then
right.
Same language.
Yes, yes, for sure, right. Yeah. No, I don't have anything. I mean, that's look. I think it underscores what we had spoken about earlier, and we've seen this before. That it's the point of lo yachu hitmameya, where the Torah says Israel could not tarry. It sounds like if we could have tarried, we would have tarried, and not necessarily just to bake bread, because the other person who tarries and doesn't want to leave is, of course, Lot, in the story of Sodom, which is the parallel story to Yetziat Mitzrayim. In other words, from the very beginning, I mean, that's the medrash. And by the way, about Chamushim, that's the famous medrash. That Chamushim says the medrash, it's not the pshat, but the idea of the medrash is very deep, which is 4/5 never left. The people that left Egypt were 20%. 80% of the Jews never left. That's a rather remarkable statement, given the fact that there are 10 plagues. The Egyptians are dying all around them. You have the Makat Bechorot. I mean, you say, what could be more obvious? And they're also drowning out babies and trying to steal the women. I mean, and yet 80% don't leave. It's not easy to leave a place. You've been there for a couple of 100 years. It's never easy to leave your home. You can sit and judge people from a distance, but if you're in that situation, it's not simple to leave. And that, I think, is that's what I mentioned before, the deep point over here of the story, is that it takes a long time for people to begin to think differently. When change takes place, any kind of change, and this is a drastic change to become your own people, but any kind of change, we are creatures of habit, and we even rationalize things that somehow we feel are not right. We put up with many things because to change things always is risky. So I think that's part of it. Part of it, they're talking like Egyptians. I mean, we've seen this throughout the story. And I'll give one other example of it. When Moshe first grows up and goes out into the world and he sees the Jew beating the Egyptian, beating the Jew, and he intervenes and he smites the Egyptian and buries the Egyptian. And the next day he sees two Jews fighting. And he says to the wicked one, why do you hit your friend? Why do you hit your neighbor? Right. Who made you the boss over us? You're going to kill us the way you killed the Egyptian? I mean, the ultimate crime is killing the Egyptian taskmaster because they think like Egyptians. Misam Chala'ish Sabri Shofet Olena was language you find in the story of Lot. The Lot is in Sodom. Echad Bala Gur Vayishpot Shafot. It's the same story. That basically they're accusing Moshe of being kind of he's mixing in where he doesn't belong. What are you trying to change things for? What are you going? I mean, what do you kill the Egyptians? They beat us. Fine, but that's the way it is. You have the right to intervene over here. So it's so deep. That's the point, and I think that's exactly the point of the language being similar. It's an excellent observation that they're talking this kind of language, and the challenge that Moshe has before him, and Joseph has. When Joseph talks to his brothers, he says, "You aren't getting out of this place. The question that when you read the study of the book of Bereshit, why didn't the brothers leave earlier? They came to get food, they got food. Why don't they go back? And the answer is, the Torah says, you become part of the society. You're not going to go back. You've seen Joseph has power, maybe they have all kinds of perks, and it's not so easy to leave that behind. Certainly after a couple of 100 years, which Israel's in Egypt for 3 generations, it's not so simple. And that's exactly the great challenge that Moshe will face, and that Israel will face. And it will take 2 generations. We're entering into the 3 weeks now, Shivasa B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. Shivasa B'Tammuz, among other things, marks the story of the golden calf. And Tisha B'Av is the story of the spies, the 2 great sins. And those are the 2 sins that doom Israel to consign Israel to the desert. We can't escape it. It takes more than 1 generation. First, a real exile. We're exiled from the land before we get to the land. And that Torah is reminding us all the time about the difficulties. It's not so simple. And I'm not even blaming anybody here. It's not about blame. The point that the Medrash points out, only 20% leave, says the Medrash. Don't take it literally, but the point is, they're pointing out the great difficulty of trying to affect any kind of change. People by their nature are very conservative, and they're not willing to make any changes. So this is the task that lies before us. Okay, well, next week we'll continue with the story. We'll talk about exactly the people's response before we cross the sea, and then what happens before, what God does before we cross the sea, the crossing of the sea, and that'll be the goal to finish this section. And then we can start, hopefully, and next time we convene with these classes would be Shirat Hayam. Thank you once again. If anybody has any other comments, questions, or whatever, dsilber@risha.org. You can always
Thank you.
Email me.
Right.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Okay, very
Take
good. Thank
care.
you all.